Part I of Johann Sebastian Bach by Herbert F. Peyser. This recording is in the public domain. In families of unusual longevity and fruitfulness, observed Goethe, nature has a way of bringing forth in her own good time one figure who unites all the greatest and most distinctive qualities of his various forebears. The poet of Faust alluded to this mystic process of genealogy with reference to Voltaire. Actually, he might with quite as much reason have been speaking of Bach. For Bach combined and brought into sharpest focus the musical talents and predilections of almost three antecedent generations, as well as their physical and moral sturdiness, their spirituality, their robust clannishness. Yet the miracle of Johann Sebastian Bach transcends even this amazing fusion of ancestral traits. It is hardly excessive to look upon him as the consummation and fulfillment of all the musical trends that went before him, and, in a manner of speaking, the origin of all those that came after. There is probably nothing in the history of music to compare with Bach's ancestry from the standpoint of fertility, complexity, and endurance. There can be no question of tracing here its multiple ramifications and cross-currents. Enough that we obtain our earliest glimpse of Sebastian's great-great-great-grandfather as far back as the latter part of the 16th century. The direct line of the great composer did not die out till 1845. 7 generations thus stretch between the extremes of this genealogical phenomenon. The Thuringian countryside around Arnstadt, Erfurt, Weimar, Eisenach, and other communities of the region cradled the different branches of the family. 2 traits, at least, all of them had in common: their love of music and their attachment to one another. Some became organists, some cantors, some town musicians, and their devotion to their craft was so proverbial that for years after all musicians in the town of Erfurt came to be known as the Bachs, even if totally unrelated. The real Bachs felt each other's company so indispensable that, if the members of the family could obviously not all live in the same place, they made it a point to hold periodic reunions. After prayers and hymns they spent the day in feasting and jolly recreation. One of their favorite amusements was to extemporize choruses out of popular songs, and these lusty medleys, or as they called them, quodlibets, they would bellow for hours on end with great good humor, while the listeners laughed till their sides ached. Son of a court musician. Johann Sebastian Bach was born in Eisenach on March 21, 1685, according to the old-style reckoning, which is 10 days behind the Gregorian calendar. His father, Johann Ambrosius Bach, had married an Elisabeth Limmerhirt nearly 20 years earlier in Erfurt, where he was town player. Probably he became court musician to Duke Johann Georg at Eisenach, whither he had removed. His plea to return to Erfurt was disallowed by his noble employer, and so it came that Johann Sebastian saw the light in Eisenach. Not, however, in the rambling house on the Frauenplan, as traditionally supposed. Comparatively recent investigation has shown that the actual birthplace is a short distance away, in a street named after Martin Luther. A rather unromantic-looking dwelling, it was occupied till just before the Second World War by a barber. There is a certain symbolic propriety that Bach should have been born in Eisenach rather than in the more prosaic Erfurt. Eisenach had powerful religious and romantic associations. Luther had been entertained by Frau von Cotta in one of its gabled houses while the reformer was still a boy. High above the city towered the Wartburg, where Luther translated the Bible, threw his inkwell at the devil, and composed some of his sturdiest chorales. Up there, too, had dwelt the saintly Elisabeth, while in its halls knightly minnesingers had competed in tourneys of song. In the remoter distances rose the fabled Hörselberg, where, according to legend, Dame Venus held her unholy court and ensnared the souls of unwary men. Just what impression these things made on the child Bach we cannot say. At any rate, he could not remain untouched by the currents of music. The boy had a pretty treble voice, and at the local school he sang in the so-called Kalender choir, making a few pennies now and then on feasts and holidays, at weddings and at funerals, in company with his schoolmates. He may even have sat in the organ loft of St. George's Church, pulling out the heavy stops for his uncle, Johann Bach, who had been the organist there for many years. Nevertheless, we have no elaborate record of Johann Sebastian's boyhood. His father, indeed, taught him the rudiments of violin and viola, and Terry credits the youngster with patient concentration in the pursuit of these instrumental studies. We do know that he became before long an uncommonly proficient violinist, but took particular delight in playing viola when he participated in ensemble work. Like Mozart in after years, the youthful Bach loved to find himself in the middle of the harmony. Early years at school. At the Eisenach Gymnasium he learned reading and writing, catechism, biblical history, and the Psalms; and when only a little over 8 he was fairly immersed in Latin conjugations and declensions. In Eisenach was laid the foundation of that learning which distinguished his whole life, though he never enjoyed the advantage of a college education such as he afterwards gave his famous sons. Yet his school attendance at this early stage showed a good deal of irregularity, due perhaps to illness or bereavement. He was only 9 when he lost his mother. In a short time his father married again, but his death terminated that union scarcely 4 months later. The Eisenach household having broken up, Johann Sebastian was sent in 1695 to the home of his married brother, Johann Christoph, who lived at Ohrdruf, some 30 miles away. A pupil of the great Johann Pachelbel, the Ohrdruf Bach functioned as organist at the Church of St. Michael's. Johann Christoph, an accomplished musician, lost no time in giving his young brother his first lessons on the clavier. Presumably he supplemented them with instruction on the organ. In any case, the boy seems to have had access to a large quantity of good music. He was an extraordinarily capable student with a voracious appetite for musical learning, and no sooner had he mastered one difficult task than he plagued his brother for another more difficult still. At this period occurred that celebrated incident for which Johann Christoph has been very harshly judged by posterity. A collection of clavier pieces by masters like Froberger, Carroll, Pachelbel, Böhm, and Buxtehude lay in a bookcase with a latticed front. Johann Sebastian's pleas to study them met with a stern refusal. So the youngster resorted to stratagem. By thrusting his hands through the lattice and rolling up the music, he managed to extract it when his brother's back was turned. Not being allowed a candle, he copied out the various works by moonlight, a job which occupied him for 6 months and probably laid the foundation for those eye troubles which toward the last were to rob him of his sight. Nor did he enjoy the fruit of his labors. Johann Christoph found the copy and promptly confiscated it. Before blaming him, as is usually done, it may be well to reflect that Bach's brother was not necessarily moved by an impulse of cruelty, but more probably felt the need of curbing somewhat an audacious and immature young genius who threatened to get out of hand. During the 5 years he spent in Ohrdruf, Bach attended the town school, which enjoyed an unusually high reputation throughout Thuringia. His studies, naturally, ranged much further afield than at Eisenach, and his scholastic progress appears to have been rapid. His high, clear voice and instinctive musicianship not only assured him a place, and rather substantial reward, in the chorus of the institution, but in proper season gained him the friendly interest of Elias Herder, a young musician summoned to replace Johann Arnold, a highly unpopular teacher who had been dismissed as a pest of the school, a scandal of the church and a cancer of the community. Through the good offices of Herder, young Bach found an opportunity to join the select choir (Mettenchor) of St. Michael's Church in Lüneburg, more than 200 miles to the north. Student at Lüneburg. The time was ripe, at all events, for Johann Sebastian to leave Ohrdruf. His brother's family was increasing apace and the organist's quarters had been growing uncomfortably cramped. Furthermore, Bach was now 15, an age at which boys were expected to start earning their living. So the chance to remove to Lüneburg proved a stroke of luck. But there were more fascinating advantages to it than even the possibilities of bed and board. Easily accessible were several sources of musical and cultural inspiration. In Lüneburg itself the Church of St. John had as its organist none less than Georg Böhm, one of the outstanding personalities in German music of the era preceding the full unfoldment of Bach's grandeur. 30 miles off lay Hamburg, which harbored the venerable master of the organ, Adam Reinken, and the operatic life of that city had burst into bloom under the leadership of Reinhold Keyser. Up in the direction of the Danish frontier, the town of Lübeck sheltered still another giant, the organist Dietrich Buxtehude. 60 miles in an easterly direction lay Celle, whose Duke Georg Wilhelm had married a beautiful and spirited French Huguenot, Eleanor Desmier d'Olbreuse, and turned his court into a miniature Versailles, where French musicians in particular were royally welcomed. Naturally, a little opera house formed part of this island of Gallic charm, elegance, and culture, enlivened by a continual succession of ballets, operas, and other musical diversions. Whether Bach obtained admission to the auditorium or whether he was smuggled into the orchestra pit by some friendly player we do not know. But of one thing we are certain: his love for the music of the French masters and his intimate acquaintance with it was in large degree the result of what he heard and learned at the gracious ducal court of Celle. Bach spent almost 3 years at Lüneburg, where St. Michael's Church and its conventual buildings were his home. He continued his studies at the Partikularschule of the church, sang with the Mettenchor, and was a member of the Chorus Symphoniacus, of which the choir formed the nucleus. He developed gradually into a capable organist and came under the healthy influence of Georg Böhm at the Church of St. John, whose impress can be detected in some of Bach's early organ works. Böhm was a pupil of Adam Reinken and undoubtedly urged the young man to hear the aged master, though one can readily imagine that Bach would sooner or later have sought out Reinken of his own volition. The summer vacation of 1701 found him traveling afoot to Hamburg. The patriarch had been organist of St. Catherine's Church half his life, and though now nearly 80, continued to be famous for his virtuosity and his extraordinary skill in improvisation. Nor was it his executive powers alone which captured his young listener. Reinken's compositions fascinated him, and their influence is perceptible in certain of Bach's clavier pieces 20 years later. This first trip to Hamburg was by no means Bach's last, and thereby hangs a tale, a fish story, if you will, but nevertheless true and related a number of times by Bach himself. Tired and hungry on his long jaunt back to Lüneburg, the boy sat down for a moment's rest outside the kitchen of an inn whose open windows exhaled tempting savors. Suddenly there fell at his feet the heads of 2 herrings, a fish prized as a great delicacy in his native Thuringia. Eagerly picking them up, he found inside of each a Danish ducat, obviously put there by some kindly soul who had caught sight of the famished young wanderer. Whether or not Bach ate the heads, he suddenly found himself with money enough for an ample dinner and sufficient also to defray the expenses of another visit to Hamburg. Organist at Arnstadt. It may be taken for granted that Bach planned an eventual journey to Lübeck to hear the mighty Buxtehude. In any case, this trip was deferred. Hard as he had studied at Lüneburg, and greatly as his musical powers had grown, it was becoming clear that he must put his talents to practical use. He had been earning a living of a sort with his singing, and likewise as a violin and viola player. But his voice had changed and was no longer of great use as a source of revenue. His powers as an organist, on the other hand, were expanding prodigiously, a fact which had become known not only in Lüneburg, but far away in his native Thuringia. He began to long for an organ post of his own and the steady income it would assure. Late in 1702 the news spread that a new organ was being completed at the Church of St. Boniface in Arnstadt, one of the ancestral seats of the Bach family and rich in its traditions. Doubtless Arnstadt had its eyes on the promising disciple of Böhm and Reinken, young as he was. Bach, too, felt it wise to watch the situation at close range. So he returned to Thuringia. The new instrument of St. Boniface was not ready, nor was it completed till the summer of 1703. Sangerhausen offered a possibility, but that was thwarted by the machinations of high-placed people with influence. Yet by Easter Bach found himself enrolled in the service of Duke Johann Ernst, brother of the reigning Duke Wilhelm Ernst of Weimar. His stay in Weimar on this occasion was brief, though it seems to have earned him some honors, including the useful if misleading title of Princely Saxon Court Organist. But scarcely 3 months later he was back in Arnstadt, where the St. Boniface organ was ready for its test. That Bach should have been entrusted with so responsible a task indicates how high must have been his reputation already. He examined the instrument, reported favorably on it, and to demonstrate his satisfaction played an inaugural recital which impressed the Consistory to such a degree that on August 9 he was officially appointed organist. It was not long before he was at odds with the authorities. He had, in addition to his organ playing, the disagreeable job of training the choristers, a shiftless, good-for-nothing rabble from the local school, who, as the city council complained, behave in a scandalous manner, resort to places of ill repute, and do other things we shrink from naming. Bach, for his part, had already developed that obstinate, uncompromising nature that grew more violent the older he became, and brought him into no end of difficulties throughout his life. When his mind was fixed on achieving a certain end, nothing would swerve him from it. He could be as hard-headed and intransigent a fighter for what he considered his rights and as ruthless in combating opposition as were Beethoven and Wagner in later generations. His extraordinary talents did not prevent him from attracting a number of enemies, which progressively increased. One of the most bitter of these was a bassoonist named Geyersbach, whom Bach on more than one occasion had to reproach for his musical incompetence. Matters came to a head when the organist, escorting a lady home one night, was set upon by the ruffian, accompanied by a brawling rout of students who attempted to cane him. As tough a fighter as the best of them, Bach took to his sword when Geyersbach shouted "Hundsfot!" (cowardly rascal), and with the roar of "Zippelfagotist!" laid about him so furiously that the nanny-goat bassoonist escaped manhandling only by the prompt help of his cronies. The incident caused considerable agitation among the townsfolk. Scarcely had it subsided when Bach upset the Consistory by requesting a month's leave to make that pilgrimage to Buxtehude in Lübeck which he had been unable to carry out in Lüneburg not long before. He secured as a substitute in his absence a cousin, Johann Ernst, whose efficiency he guaranteed. Grudgingly the authorities complied, unwilling to risk an issue with so valuable, if testy, a servant. While Bach did not make the whole journey of 300 miles on foot, he undoubtedly walked a fair part of the way. He timed his trip to arrive in Lübeck for Buxtehude's famous Abendmusicen at the Marienkirche, which had been celebrated for a generation and which were continued under the veteran's successors until the 19th century. These evening musicales, in which instrumentalists as well as choristers participated, were carried out on a scale larger than anything to which the young organist had been accustomed. One thing this Lübeck visit did was to give Bach a heightened idea of music in its relation to public worship, an idea he strove to carry out for the rest of his life, but realized only fully when he was at the height of his tremendous powers in Leipzig. End of Part 1.